Welcome back to our continuing series where we talk to reporters, writers, columnists, academics, philosophers, activists from the left, from the right, any background. We don't care. We just want to have informed discussions with you. We've been doing pretty good on the academic side, but with us today is somebody from the media. Deep Dive with Shawn C. Fettig. It is a podcast available on Audible and Apple Podcasts, wherever those are found. Interview with Shawn Fettig, host and producer of the Deep Dive with Shawn Fettig. Political scientist and interested in trust, how our governments and politicians can gain our trust and how they lose it, but also how our personal stories can build trust and bind us together. While I sometimes talk about things that might be making news, there is no punditry here. Instead, this podcast is dedicated to diving deeper into interesting topics with interesting people doing interesting things. That's what the podcast Deep Dive with Shawn Fettig is about. I was interviewed on there a while back. That's how I met Shawn, and I've asked him to come on and do an interview with me. And also wanted to ask about this particular episode you had done, January 17th, 2022. James Howden, political violence and extremism on the right, on the rise and on the right. In this episode is the first of another two-parter focusing on the rise of political violence and right-wing extremism in America. In this episode, I'm talking to Dr. James Howden, director for the Center of Peace and Study and Violence Prevention at Virginia Tech. Did I get anything wrong with your name, the show, the background, or is there other information that you want us to provide to the public?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. Why? Let's just start with the obvious. Why did you do a show on political polarization last year, June of last year, so basically summer of last year, only a few months ago? Why you do a show and you cover a wide variety of topics that are of general interest, kind of a smorgasbord, if you will. That's one of the things I liked about your show format. Why specifically look at political polarization in summer of last year? Why did you think that was a worthy subject worth covering? What are you seeing as somebody who studies the news, who tries to stay on top of what's going on, and who interviews people? You know, somebody who's more of an active player than just a passive absorber of the news. What are you seeing? Why did you think this was important about summer of last year?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for having me here.
Absolutely.
I don't know that the timing matters so much. So, the summer of last year just happened to be when, I was kind of unrolling or unveiling kind of Deep Dive. So it was more, I think the bigger connection is the fact that I am a political scientist and I've studied American political science and government. And like you noted, my focus has primarily always been on, institutional trust in the judiciary and queer rights. But I'm a bit of a polyglot. So, I've always been interested in, a lot of things related to politics. And the podcast was just a way for me to kind of, marry a whole bunch of my interests and bring on people that know a lot more about these things than I do. But I think, you'd probably agree with me that, it's nearly impossible to have a conversation with people. I mean, it used to be nearly impossible, I think, to talk about politics without also in some way there being a nexus with polarization. But I think now it's nearly impossible to have conversations with people about almost anything without there being some nexus that includes some type of polarization. In fact, on a handful of my episodes, and most recently, within the last couple of episodes, I discuss having friends that have told me stories about how, their relationships with their families just cannot continue, or, they've either had to, end their relationship with their family members, or they've had to draw clear boundaries on how they interact with family because they just can't be around family without in some way or form political, polarization being part of that conversation. So it's definitely infested pretty much every aspect of our life. So
when did you notice this trend? I'm guessing you're 30 or 40-ish. You've been around for at least a little while. I'm guessing this isn't a 20-year thing you've noticed. This is something relatively recently. How far back ago did you notice this trend of, damn, I can't have a political conversation at all these days, and wow, people are cutting off family members? How far back do we have to go when you go, yeah, this is different? This is a new era. I remember growing up in the USA, it wasn't always like this. This is different. When did you sort of can you benchmark that trend? I know that's a little bit difficult, and this is an estimate, but roughly, is this something you started seeing yesterday, a year ago, or 20 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. And again, being a political scientist and so steeped in that world, I think I might have, a different view because it's just a larger part of my life than most people. So I think there's two ways to answer this question. I think one is for your average person. I think it's probably not controversial to say that, the rise, I wish there was a better way to say this, but the rise of Donald Trump probably was a real marker for people as to probably a moment in time when they could articulate and identify a specific moment where politics entered their personal relationships with their family in a way that they just couldn't avoid, and was much more divisive than maybe it had been in past. I remember, very vividly, like the 2000 election where people were saying, and again, at the time I was studying political science. And so, to me, it was just a very visceral and very real thing. That election was something that, I was very involved in, not in the campaigns, but in, participating in like researching it and understanding it and, being an advocate for one of the candidates. And that was just a big part of my life. But I remember people at that time being like, I'm not going to vote because it doesn't matter who wins. Bush wins, Gore wins. At the end of the day, they're the same, right? Like you're going to get the same thing.
Yep.
And I remember being appalled by that at the time. And I was actually just thinking about this today that like there was a certain amount of truth in that. There were certain things when it came to like foreign policy and when it came to like a value related to democracy or voting that I think we all shared. That we can't say anymore. That is not true anymore, right? Like and to some degree, some might argue that's a good thing. That polarization within the public is actually a good thing. You should have two very stark, different choices between candidates. Otherwise, what's the point of elections? But okay, so that answers the question of for your average person. Let me tell you what I think, and maybe this is an academic response.
Please. We try to do both here. We try to do both.
So I think the contemporary Republican Party is, maybe in hindsight, a totally predictable product of some changes the party made to the way it operates in the 80s and 90s. So you might remember, maybe not, but Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment that Republicans should never say anything negative about another Republican.
Right.
So suddenly, the party coalesced around the idea that their own members could not be called out for bad behavior or illegal behavior or bad policy, et cetera. And then in the 90s, so like 10 years later, Newt Gingrich, as the Speaker of the House, instituted a policy that the House would never vote on anything that didn't have more than 50% support from Republicans in the conference. So now, no policy, no legislation, nothing will be considered unless Republicans agree with it. So that might seem normal to us today, but at the time, it really shredded bipartisanship. So working across the aisle and negotiating. And what happened as a result of that is we saw, a rise of extremists within the party, within the Republican Party. There were no longer any guardrails. So extremists could say and do anything without any accountability from within their own party, thanks to Reagan's 11th commandment. And then they could hold, the entire party hostage on legislation because they know that the party won't work with Democrats to pass anything. And that's thanks to Newt Gingrich. So that's how we get where we are, where stupid people run for and win high office. They hold the entire country hostage. We're seeing that with the debt ceiling now. And they get what they want at every turn, despite having, really no ability to govern. And they represent a vanishingly small slice of the electorate. But all those seeds, where we are today, that was all laid in the 80s and 90s. And it's just taken this amount of time. It really took, I think the catalyst was we needed somebody with absolutely no shame to run and total self-interest to run for office to kind of eviscerate the remaining guardrails that were in place. And Donald Trump filled that.
Okay. Let me ask you a question. I get what you're saying. So you go back to Ronald Reagan, and he was saying, don't ever criticize fellow Republicans. You go back to Newt Gingrich, highly partisan era. I remember reading about Gingrich in high school, and he was definitely changing the way things worked. I think one of the things they did was you used to have dinners. You would say whatever during the day, but at night you'd have dinners with people from the other party, in your own homes. And Gingrich ended that. So they were like, maybe I trashed you during the day, but at night, your wife knows my wife, and we'd have dinner and a couple beers in the evening. The public would never see that, but we knew each other, Democrats, Republicans. As I understand, Gingrich started to kill that. Don't hang out, don't have dinner with the other side. So absolutely something going there. Let's fast forward to now. Joseph Biden is a Democrat, a liberal. He goes on television and gives a speech with a blood red backdrop, not typical for presidential speech, and active duty Marine Guard, not typical for presidential speech. And he says 78 million Americans are basically enemies of the state. Does that help polarization or massively exacerbate it?
Yeah. So, I mean, Joseph Biden, first of all, to be a Democrat doesn't necessarily mean a liberal. And I think a lot of liberals would take issue with anyone calling Biden a liberal. But, I take your point.
Not Republican. Is this a good call that he did that? Does that make things better in America?
No, but I guess I would flip the question. Like, what could Joe Biden do to make it better? What could Joe Biden do that would somehow reach the ears of maybe, we have to separate the electorate from the elites. So the elites are, Republicans holding office, right? But those are the people that he needs to pass his legislation. What could he do that Republicans would lean into and not eviscerate him for or demonize him for?
That's fair. But when he gave that speech, it was independents and fellow Democrats who said, damn, kind of put some more fuel on the fire. It wasn't just Republicans. It was members of his own party and the independents who said, wow. And in response, there were other liberals saying, not hardcore enough.
Yeah.
So you should have done even more. So we have something that's at least controversially or debatably polarizing. And we have half the country saying, not hardcore, you should have done more, Joe Biden, when what he did was enough to scare Democrats and independents. I mean, that would at least show that there's something coming from the left that doesn't exactly help the polarization situation. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I mean, I would never say that Democrats are, cohesively and as one unit and, consistently working towards unification, and Republicans are not. I think there's always people that are, there are Republicans that I'm sure are interested in bipartisanship and unification, and there are Democrats I'm sure that are interested in more division. I think one of the things that any president, Biden, I think, is struggling with this as well is, I don't think that, I do take issue with 50% of the country this and 50% of the country that, because I don't think that's true. And I don't think independents actually make up as big a part of the electorate as we might think that they do. And I don't think they're as persuadable as we think that they are. I think at the end of the day, we're talking about tops 3% of the population is persuadable. They may not vote, but I don't know that they're that persuadable. At the end of the day, though, what Joe Biden is trying to do here is appease both the moderate wing of the Democrat. And I think there is much more a sense of moderates in the Democratic Party than there are moderates in the Republican Party these days. And I think he's trying to bridge a gap between the moderates in the Democratic Party and the liberals in the Democratic Party. And I mean, I take your point. I think it's a very difficult needle to thread, and it remains to be seen if it's successful for him.
We had how bad is polarization now compared to the 1960s and the Civil War? You're a political science scholar. Is it just as bad as the 60s? Not as bad? Just as bad as the Civil War? We're hearing different things, and some of it's just, bloviating rhetoric. How bad is this? Nah, it's not that bad. We've had worse in the past, or damn, this is kind of a new level of in certain ways that we've never seen before.
Well, I mean, we had a civil war. So, arguably, if that were our only measure, we could argue that was worse, right?
Sure.
That being said, though, I think, and scholars are increasingly writing and talking about this, is that all of those indicators that played into the culmination of the Civil War, we're seeing afoot now, right? Like those are, but I find that fascinating because, and maybe it's just because we're so far removed, like nobody living today remembers the Civil War, right? But what does that look like in 2023, 2024, 2025, in not only the United States, but in the world, if the United States were to go to civil war, what does civil war look like? I don't know. And how do we get there? Here's what I will say, though, is there's something fundamentally different, I think, than at least over the last 40 years. I want to keep out the 1960s because I do think the 1960s were an interesting beast when the parties themselves were realigning, although I would argue that the parties themselves we might be living through a realignment of the parties right now that still hasn't shaken out, and it could be our saving grace, right? That this is a party realignment more than it is a complete fracturing of our civil society.
Okay.
But here's what I'll say is, and I'll answer it this way. So, spare me a little bit of background. So, I read a lot of news. This shouldn't come as a shock, right? So I read a lot of news. I listen to a lot of podcasts that include, like journalists and academics. And, interestingly enough, I don't watch a lot of news, but I find it really fascinating and also irritating to listen to, quote unquote journalists and news, organizations talking about politics today. And they talk about, they always preface their stories with, just how horrible what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, or whatever new horrific policy he's just signed, or whatever fucking awful thing is happening in Tennessee, or, whatever Donald Trump just said. They talk about just how awful that all is, but then they always pivot to, but Ron DeSantis is playing it really smart by trying to find this lane in the Republican Party, at a time that Donald Trump is really dominating, so that's really smart of him to do this. And then, or Donald Trump, like he's doing a really good job of like making sure that the primary, field remains wide open for him, that he kind of dominates that. And I think what that does is it, one, normalizes really awful shit and makes us think like that this is just typical. This is typical politics. This is how politics are played. And at the end of the day, this is just the horse race, right? Like this is these are politicians fighting over an election, and then it'll all just revert to some kind of a mean or some kind of a normal, which is not true. I don't believe that. But I also think that it discounts and dismisses the impact that these policies are actually having on people's lives. Like what's happening to particularly queer folks in the United States should be alarming and terrifying to people, right? Like it's ruining people's lives. And so the reason I'm telling you this, though, is we've had stuff like this before, right? You mentioned periods of time, the 1960s, and then, I guess the 1860s as well, as being periods of time where we've had really deep divisions in the United States that have boiled over into, potential fractures of our, society. And this looks like that. Here's where I think it's particularly alarming to me is in past, we've had two, and we can get into, my problem with a two-party system, but we've had two dominant parties that, they keep each other in check by being the two dominant parties and competing for votes. But there is a component of it that really requires each of the parties to keep themselves in check. So like their internal policies and what they're internally willing to allow and who they're willing to be on the ticket and what their rules are and who they're going to denounce and who they, will hold accountable within their own party. It really requires each of the parties to do that for themselves. The Democratic Party can't hold the Republican Party accountable for who they allow into the party, right? Or what they allow their platform to be, and vice versa. And in past, for the most part, the parties have had a certain amount of shame and responsibility. So they have, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, given a certain period of time in its history, have denounced racists, have been very clear about extremists within their party as being, maybe some part of their party or some part of the electorate, but they haven't glorified it or embraced it. What we're seeing today is the Republican Party has essentially just dropped those guardrails and are openly allowing that to spill over, right? It spills over from the party into the electorate. They no longer have those guardrails where it's shameful to have, open racists or white supremacists in the party or advocating for the overthrow of government or, the destruction of democracy. That used to be off limits and the party would police that themselves. Now they're not. And that scares me.
What about Democratic Party officials when Trump was president who said, you know, if you see a Trump official, physically go up and accost them. Or if they get close to you, it's okay to punch them. I saw a lot of Democrats saying that. Does that help with polarization or does that make it worse?
Well, I mean, if that happened, obviously not. But what are we talking about? Are we talking about Democrats in the electorate, or are we talking about elected officials?
I would say elected officials like Maxine Waters. There was a couple of other high-ranking Democrats. There was also the guy on CNN who was a big left reporter, said it's okay to go ahead and punch Nazis in the face as a way of dealing with political repercussions. And I was like, that does not seem like, hey, let's talk our agreements over. That sounds like you're saying get physical. And there were Democrats who absolutely did that, and they were not repudiated by the Democratic Party at all.
Yeah, I mean, I come back to the same point I made before, which is like, yeah, you have your extremists and your rogues in each of the parties, and I don't, I mean, at the risk of sounding like just another placater, like, of course, we just saw this today, right? Like, so a congressman's office was attacked. We don't know what the reason was, but somebody came in with a bat and, beat two of the staffers, and the response was, like, there's, violence is never okay in politics and in our political discourse.
Ever.
So, and I subscribe to that, and I agree. I agree with that. I don't want to sound like a placater in saying that. So yeah, no, of course, anybody saying like violence in any form is a legitimate form of political discourse, I think is, they're wrongheaded. I also think, and I want to be careful with this because this is to some degree academic. It makes me wonder, like, do you say that to, people in, I don't know, like the Uyghurs in China? Like, at what point, like, at what point do they have a right to physically resist what's happening to them?
True.
And I think that's the argument Republicans, extremist Republicans are making right now. Like the insurrectionists, that's the argument they're making. Like, we disagree with them, or at least I disagree with them. Right. I don't think that this was a legitimate form of political discourse based on what they believed or convinced themselves to believe was happening. But they believed it. Right. They believed that they were in, or at least they're saying they believed it, that this was to them, they had been pushed to whatever their boundary was, and that therefore violence became a legitimate response. I disagree. But I do think there is a conversation to be had there that doesn't legitimize the argument that Republican Party is making right now that victimizes the insurrectionists.
It's kind of a short interview. I appreciate you coming out. I got about 5 minutes left. I'd like to ask you one big question, if I can. This is going to require a theoretical thinking cap. But you have a show, Deep Dive with Shawn Fettig, covers a lot of different topics, political science background, very smart, good show, covers a lot of different issues. How do we fix this? Realistically, no unicorns, because I'm tired of people giving me unicorn solutions. Realistically, how does this get fixed?
I don't know that it does, to be honest with you. I think it's funny you asked this question. This is a question I ask on Deep Dive as well. And I say the same thing. Like, I don't want you to give me, like, it's the last chapter of every book, which is like, here are the fixes that are totally unrealistic.
Thank you.
Like that all politicians just need to be more cool, like level-headed and work towards bipartisanship. Well, that's not going to happen.
You see what I'm saying? Yeah.
So, I mean, to be honest with you, I don't think that it does get worked out. I mean, you said we only have like 5 minutes left, but let me just say a couple of things. So I think the biggest mistake that we made in the United States, if you'll give me some latitude, was at the inception of the country. I don't think we were ever one country to begin with. At best, we were maybe two distinct countries, maybe more. But, at least the North and the South, the abolitionist and slave owning and industrial and agricultural. And so trying to make us into one country that never really had a cohesive unifying value, to me, was like a fool's errand, from the beginning. And the problems that are born out of it, that were born out of it are at the heart, I think, of our friction today. But like, so how do we solve that problem? And the answer is, I don't know. I had Arlie Hochschild on Deep Dive. She's the author of the book Strangers in Their Own Land. And we talked about this, and she said that we need to identify some value that we share across conservative and liberal, blue state and red state, that unifies us as Americans. An example would be like during the Cold War, there was democracy, this value of democracy. We all shared that, right? But Republicans don't believe in that anymore. So I don't know what value we all share now that's big enough and strong enough to overcome kind of the divisions that separate us right now. And I know that you have talked about, or this is something that you've been involved in, as being secession, at least for California. But I don't know what that
started. Yeah.
But I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what, outside of some type of armed conflict, setting everything else aside, which Congress, in tandem with some president, allows any one state, let alone huge swaths of the country, to secede. So that leaves essentially armed conflict in pursuit of secession. And I just don't know what that looks like.
I think I answered that in our interview, but would you ever be willing to come back on again, do another interview in the future?
Well, I would never say no, of course. Sure.
Okay. I know this is short for the public. I'm going to have Shawn back on, and we'll do a deep dive here. In the meantime, you can find Deep Dive with Shawn Fettig. It's a great show. He also interviewed me. I think it was a pretty good show.
It was the second episode, too. That was early days.
Hey, that's right. That's right. It was the second episode, and we talked about it. Good show. I'm sorry for this being short. I'm going to have you back on. Is that okay? I'll email you a copy of this video, and I'll see what your schedule is, if that's workable.
Yeah, reach out anytime.
Okay. Thanks for coming on, Shawn. I'm sorry it's short. I will contact you today and send you the video and book another meeting.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shawn. That's the end of our show, and I'll see you all soon.